Well, unlike a lot of people I knew at the time who were committed Christians, my view was that I wanted to go wherever I thought the evidence was leading me. I wasn't going to go simply where I wanted to go, but if it looked like the evidence took me one direction, I wanted to follow that. And as I studied the Bible, I learned Greek, and I started reading the New Testament in Greek, and then I learned Hebrew and I started reading the Old Testament in Hebrew, and I started finding discrepancies and errors, mistakes, contradictions. And at a point, I just realized that trying to reconcile all these was not really satisfactory intellectually. And so I realized that my faith that the Bible was the inerrant word of God with no mistakes of any kind was just factually wrong. And I decided, it's better to believe something that's true than something that's false. And this seems to me to be a false belief. And so I left evangelical Christianity for that reason.
And my update is I dropped the Bible altogether. And it's not because I'm going astray or anything. I simply realized so many misunderstandings and so many contradictions within the Bible, within the New Testament and within the Old Testament as well. There are so many, I just couldn't keep it up with it.
That the Bible has been changed, tampered with, and corrupted.
We don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. So we don't have the originals, they disappeared. And all the copies that we have disagree with each other at some point. Sometimes it's quite a few disagreements. A question to ask here is, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? It's absolutely proven that they did. No two manuscripts are alike, so unless one of them is pristine, every single scribe made mistakes.
And there are errors that we know about. Why? Because we can compare the documents, we can compare the manuscripts and see where the errors are. In fact, let me see if I can show you a representation of that, because it's better seen than it is described. Here it is. Let's say you have, here's the original, which we don't have. We don't, at least we don't think we have any original documents, okay? So they're all copies, okay? It's okay, so they're all copies, okay? It's okay, so they're all copies, okay? It's okay, so they're all copies, okay?
But many people don't realize that over the past 2,000 years, this sacred text has changed a great deal. No first edition exists. Well, we have our copies, the first of which were made hundreds of years after the events supposedly took place. For the first 100 to 200 years, copies of the Bible were made by hand, and not by professionals, and not by professionals, and not by professionals. This led to many errors, omissions, and most importantly, changes. Here are the three biggest. The earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John did not include Jesus challenging the mob that was about to stone a woman by saying, "Let any among you who are without sin cast the first stone." In fact, the story was inserted into the book of John somewhere around 200 to 300 years later. Bill Warren, scholar at the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, told NPR, "The early church canonized books and not stories. So when it had authentic stories from Jesus in the oral tradition, they had to find a way to put it in the text." In the Gospel of Mark, we learn about how Jesus rose from the tomb on the third day and appeared to various people, including his disciples. In original manuscripts of Mark, this part of the story is nowhere to be found. Warren says scribes were seeing the other Gospels with resurrection stories, so they felt adding a resurrection story in Mark would round out the text better.
All right. Getting these platforms together, man, but all praises to the Most High, the God of Israel.
All praises.
Coming to you again, telling you to serve Him alone.
Always,
man. So, you know what I'm saying, we coming again, man, with another class on this infiltrated Bible. You know what I'm saying, because our people seem to lack the understanding that this Bible is infiltrated, man.
Correct.
Everything in this Bible is not accurate.
Right, and if you're not matching whatever's being spoken to the law, then you're not doing diligent research. So we as a people, we have to get back to doing more in-depth and diligent research.
Cool.
So with the Bible being infiltrated, we have to understand this, that there's only Satan opposes God. Only Satan will set himself before you and your God. So by examining these things, we come to the true realization of the things at hand, because because what's really at hand is your soul. What really is at hand is your eternal salvation, because what's really at hand is your soul. What really is at hand is your eternal salvation.
My question is the Bible then inaccurate in some of the things that it says Jesus said? If so, if it's inaccurate in some things, how do we know that it's not inaccurate in lots of things? And if it's inaccurate in lots of things, what makes us think we can trust it? As a historian, I'm absolutely certain that the Gospels contain sayings that Jesus did not say. One way to prove that is to point to the discrepancies of the sayings from one gospel to the next, which I could easily do and you can do for yourself. We could in fact spend 2 or 3 hours here while I simply list the discrepancies. But I'd like to take a different approach by dealing with just one kind of saying of Jesus in my couple minutes that remain. There is no doubt that in the Gospel of John, the 4th Gospel, Jesus understands himself to be God and explicitly calls himself divine. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. But he also says, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. These are sayings found only in the Gospel of John. Jesus calls himself God in the Gospel of John, the latest of our Gospels, but what is striking is that he never calls himself God in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, our earliest Gospels. I don't think Jesus really said these things. And so far as I know, either does any other critical biblical scholar. I know of hundreds of biblical scholars, but I don't personally know any scholar of the Gospel of John, except for extremely conservative evangelicals or fundamentalists, who think that John accurately records all of the words of Jesus. If Craig thinks he does, if he thinks that Jesus did go around Galilee and Jerusalem calling himself God, I'd like him to explain to me on historical, not theological grounds, but historical grounds, how Jesus managed to escape getting stoned to death for blasphemy.
There are some sayings that are difficult to reconcile, okay? This raises the question of the internal consistency of the Bible itself. And so these are often called contradictions. It doesn't take long to speak to an unbeliever before they start bringing up so-called contradictions in the Bible. Here's one, just an example. How did Judas Iscariot die? Well, if you read Matthew, it says this, and throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. Okay, Matthew's clear. He hanged himself. But then you read the book of Acts. This is Luke's account. And Luke says this, now this man, speaking of Judas, acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, head first, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. I'm glad we already ate, right? These two accounts of the death of Judas seem to be in conflict with each other. Many would argue that these are contradictory accounts. What do we say to something like this? This is what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, oftentimes, skeptics and atheists will make the claim that the Bible is full of contradictions. But when people make this claim, we as Christians, as clear-thinking Christians, shouldn't let that claim stand. Now, your impulse is going to be to say, no, the Bible doesn't have contradictions. That's going to be your impulse. What you need to do is ask a question. Someone says the Bible's full of contradictions. Your question immediately should be, can you give me some examples? Can you give me some examples? How did you come to that conclusion is essentially what you're asking. Now, sadly, most people who make the claim, this is from my own experience, if you're face-to-face with them and you say, can you give me some examples? It's full of them? Okay, give me 10. You won't get one, okay? You won't get one. That's if you're face-to-face. Now, if you try that on Facebook, if you try that on Twitter, what will happen is they won't know, but they'll go to Google, Bible contradictions, and they'll find thousands. Let me show you a few of those in a minute.
At the center of faith for more than 2 billion Christians is a book pieced together over thousands of years from many scraps of parchment and papyrus. A story of God, creation, Jesus, and human history. And the Bible is still being intensely studied at places like Yale University, where biblical scholars Joel Baden and Candida Moss are poring over some of the earliest fragments.
So here what we have is a beautiful copy of the Septuagint, and the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
Some of these were produced within a few hundred years of the crucifixion, and yet already
You can see all of these notes in the margin.
differing interpretations, omissions, and mistakes are apparent from one copy to the next. Differing interpretations, omissions, and mistakes are apparent from one copy to the next. Differing interpretations, omissions, and mistakes are apparent from one copy to the next.
It doesn't matter what parts of John you read, it all sounds the same. Why? Because in the Gospel of John, we're not hearing 3 voices, John the Baptist, Jesus, and the narrator. We're hearing one voice, the voice of the author. The author has modified the voices of John the Baptist and Jesus to make them say what he wants them to say. This is not Jesus' voice we're hearing. It's the voice of the Gospel of John, the author. Why does this matter? Because people in our world continue to ask, is Jesus who he said he was? If you read the Gospel of John, you don't learn who Jesus said he was. You learn who John said he was.
This is Wrap the News. In order to not go astray, we only or simply follow what God commanded us to do, and it is not God is a son written in the Old Testament. That's not a commandment. So you are going to go astray with that. We are all gods. That's not a commandment. You're going to go astray with that. When God said, have no gods before me, that's what you follow. God never commanded that Jesus was going to be in charge. God never gave a command that he was going to give all his power to Christ. God never gave a command that you go through Jesus now. God never gave a command that you pray through Jesus. Jesus and God gave the command of God that said we only serve God. Matthew 4:10, worship the Lord your God and serve him only, period, point blank. You can't add St. John, Mark, Luke, Matthew, Peter, and Paul to that. You know, it is straight in the Old Testament and it is in the New Testament. Matthew 20:28. The Son of Man did not come to be served. Why are y'all saying Yahweh Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, and serving Christ alongside our God when none of the prophets served Christ alongside God? Y'all are following the traditions of men, a newfangled doctrine. Mark 7:7. They worship me in vain. They teach as doctrine the precepts of men, not God. You disobey God's commands in order to obey what humans have wrote. We only follow thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not sleep with thy neighbors or covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not do this or that, thou shalt not put other gods in front of me. If it is not the commands of God, you don't follow it. We don't follow the sun, we don't follow the moon, we don't follow the Holy Spirit. You only obey God. I'll read it one more time. Words of Christ. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. This is Wrap the News.